Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Empowered to Live, where faith meets purpose and purpose fuels freedom. I'm your host, Andrea Butler. Thank you all for joining me again for our new series on breaking up with limitations. And last week, we talked about, letting go of procrastination. And I told y'all that, that was one of my biggest weaknesses. Still a work in progress, but we are getting there. And in this next week, we are talking about letting go or purging the things that no longer serve us on our journey of where we're going, where God is taking us to. And so we've got to let go of some things. And I thought about the weights that we carry around a lot of times, and even in a conversation had today in this group that I'm in, we talked a little bit about some of those things that hold us down, that hold us back, and that prevent us, past hurts, past traumas, all those different things that sometimes can hinder the progress that God wants for our lives. And how do we let go of those things that no longer serves us on the journey that we're going? Sometimes we have things and they were good for where we were, but they're not great for where we're going. And so we have to let those things go. And sometimes we want to hold on to them because they're comfortable, they're comforting, but they don't serve us. They don't serve our purpose for where we're going. And so, how do we let go? And Hebrews 12:1 says that let us throw off everything and the weight and the sin that so easily beset us, and to run with patience or endurance the race that is marked out for us. And so, she didn't say just let go of sin or let go of people, but sometimes it's good things. And I've talked about this before in past episodes, that sometimes it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing, but it can be a good thing that holds us hostage and holds us back because it's good. It makes us feel good. We like where we are. We talk about, again, like I said, the comfortable things, but they're not necessarily the God thing for where He is carrying us to. It's like you're growing up and you're 20 and you're still in the first grade, and you refuse to leave the first grade because first grade was comfortable, second grade or whatever it was that you feel that was a good place for you. And God is saying now it's time for you to let go of those things and press forward into what's new. So He said we got to throw them off. And again, like I said, throw it off is not always an easy thing for us to do, to want to let go of. You know, Recently this week, I had to get a new laptop, and I love my laptop. I've had it for a few years. All my stuff was set up on it. I was used to my laptop. I knew, the keyboard was familiar, all these things, and so the motherboard went out. I went to turn it on, it just wouldn't turn on at all. And I knew it was fully charged. It was plugged, and I plugged it in. It was charged up, but it just wouldn't turn on. And you could see the power going into it. The light would come on the side, and you could see it, and it was power, but it wasn't working. And sometimes we are attached to things, and we can see the power. The power is moving in our lives. We are called for great things, and power is coming in, but the light's not coming on. There's no activity. And so because we sometimes get stuck in those comfortable places. And so how do we let go of those things? And so that, again, letting go is a part of life. And it's challenging for us because we don't want to let go of what's familiar. Sometimes it's, we carry old roles, toxic relationships, clutter, unhealthy thought patterns, and even outdated dreams that no longer serve us. Sometimes we have dreams, and God is like, I told you to let go. And I thought about when Samuel was mourning Saul, you know, and God said to him, Saul is dead. And I said, oh, that hurt. And I was like, can you imagine, that God is saying to you, sometimes we hold on to stuff and God is like, it's dead. let it go. And we don't want to. And God has to be blunt with us, like he was with Samuel. He was like, he's like, how long are you going to mourn him? It's time to move on. Let it go. Let go of that dream. I no longer, my purpose is no longer with him. It's with something else. It's with someone else. And we've got to let go of those things. And yes, that letting go hurts because we don't want to, like we're losing a part of ourselves, a sense of who we are. Maybe our identity was tied into a certain place, a certain role, a position that we were in. And so our life changes. Sometimes our whole identity was mother or father or whatever, and our kids are grown now, and they've moved on, and we're still holding on to like they were five, and we want them to stay here. And yes, you can have close relationships, because I have a close, wonderful relationship with my daughters, but I recognize that they're adults, and sometimes they want to do things, that don't include me, and sometimes they don't include each other because they want to they have their own identity, and sometimes it's difficult. I'm like, I want to come too, and they're like, no, we're going on a sister date, and you're a mother, and so you can't come, and that's okay. I recognize my role, and I'm embracing the fact that they're adults and they need their space and their time, and so we have to let it go. And sometimes it feels scary because again we're loosening our grip on what's feeling familiar to us. But the truth is, you can't run free if you're still dragging baggage from the past. You can't run the race that's set up before you. You can't have the endurance if you're dragging, the things that God is saying let go of with you into the present. And we have to let go of those things. So think about it like, do spring cleaning. And that even hurts when you have things in your closet you didn't even know that you had, or you have things that you're like, I'm going to get back in this one day, and it's been 20 years and you haven't gotten back into it, but it's still in the back of your closet because you're like, I'm going to get into these jeans or this dress or whatever, and we won't let it go. And sometimes we have to spring clean our closet. And I know, like when we moved from the U.S. to Mexico, that's something I had to do. I went through my closet, and I'm like, I'm not going to need some of these winter clothes that I have. And there were things in my closet I hadn't worn in a while. And I was like, oh, I forgot I had this. And my kids was like, kind of let it go. And I had to tell myself that too. You need to let this go. You haven't worn it. You don't fit in it anymore. Um, you know, and so we have to reduce and let go of those things to make room for what God has. And sometimes we hold on to the good and we don't allow room for God's best. For the best for us, He has no space to in our lives because we're holding on to things that He's like, okay, I need you to get rid of that so I can give you my best. And I think if we look at it that way, that God it wants to give me His best, and therefore I need to clean up my space so that I can have what God's best for me, by letting go of those things again that no longer serve, that that's holding me back, that's holding me down, or whatever. Those are things that we have to let go of. So what are some of the ways, some practical steps that we can begin to let go? So take an inventory of your habits, your relationships, your commitments, or even your mindset, and ask yourself, does this bring me closer to God's purpose for my life, or does it drain me? So what are those things in your life? Is it pushing you forward? Is it heavy? Maybe you're carrying around resentment, or something that you've been holding on to, anger or whatever, or this mindset of, I'm a failure, or whatever it is that thought process is. Sometimes your commitments, what are you committed to that maybe you need to let go of? We kind of look at those things, and I've had to do that within the past year, and then I still added some more stuff on, and I had to make a re-inventory now of my commitments. I was talking to a friend the other night, and she was like, "You just busy. You got a whole lot of stuff going on," and I was like, "I know." And so she was just like, "I thought you were going to let go of some stuff," and I said, "And I did." But then it seemed like I added a whole lot more to my plate than I needed to. So I need to re-inventory my life and say, okay, what commitments do I have that really no longer serve me, or I did it because of the fact that, I needed something to fill the space of what I had let go of. And we do that sometimes, we add more stuff when we let go of things. Sometimes people clean their closet out and then they go shopping. And not necessarily, and then you just added back more clutter to the space, and sometimes we have to let go. And so that's what I did. I found myself, as I was talking to her and I was telling her, and she was like, oh my gosh, you got a lot of stuff going on, you're just busy, and I was just like, I am, but I'm not. But it's like, are the things that am I doing? And so I even had to ask for prayer today, that God would just show me what things am I adding to my life that are good, they're even godly, but is it what God wants for me in this season of my life? I know I'm committed to writing, I'm committed to this podcast, and so what other things can I release that is not God's plan and purpose for me, is what I want, but not necessarily what God wants for me. And so we want to ask those questions. Is it bringing me closer to my purpose? Or is it draining me? Or is it a distraction? Because it could be those things too. It could be just a distraction from, what we really need to focus on, and not allow these distractions and things to come in and hinder us from where we need to go, so that we can fully again embrace what God really wants for your life and for my life. And we have to learn how to recognize those things, and sometimes it needs an outsider sometimes to look at your life and say, hey, you're doing this, but why? Why are you doing this? Why is this activity here? What's purpose behind it? Is it a part of where you're going, or is this another place filler that you've put in place because you don't really want to push into purpose because it's not comfortable for you at this moment? So how do we recognize those things and then, move forward? And then release with intention, not regret. So letting go is not just about loss, it's about creating room for what's next. So, it is not just about loss. And so again, when it's something that we have been comfortable with, when it's been a part of our life, we've held on to this role, this commitment, whatever the relationship, for a lengthy period of time, and we have to let it go. There is that grieving of the loss. We let go, and that there's a hole of this place, and now we're uncomfortable because we've been so used to doing, and now that we've had to give up, a lot of times it does feel uncomfortable for us. And so, how do we recognize, yes, I'm grieving this loss, but then also I need to celebrate the fact that God is moving me into something else. I've made room for Him to be able to fill it with His best, and not mine, and not my own. And so we have to let that go. So I'm giving it up. So I'm making space for growth. I'm not losing. I'm just making space for the growth that God has for me, for the place He wants to take me to. And so we replace with what God gives us. So when you let go of old patterns, replace it with truth and healthy rhythms and Christ-centered practices. And so if you stop scrolling late at night, replace it with journaling or prayer. If you release draining commitments, replace it with rest and a new life-giving connection. Because sometimes, again, we are so overcommitted in our lives. And while we were talking about this, I was even talking about my daughter earlier. My oldest, we were just having this conversation about how, as women, and and especially women in leadership, in Christian leadership, or even just, I think, in leadership period, as women, we sometimes feel that we have to be the ones that step in, and we don't know how to say no, and we don't know um, how to set healthy boundaries within our lives. And so we allow ourselves to get caught up into things that, we don't necessarily want to be in, or places or spaces, or we do things. And I thought about it in my We talked about setting boundaries. Um, it was back in August, when my series in August, um, that we sometimes have need to set boundaries, and that boundaries are healthy. Boundaries are a requirement for us. It's stewardship of our life and our time, and of our the resources that we are, because we are a resource, that God uses. But if our plate is so full, then there is no room for him to be able to put what he wants onto our plate, the best that he has for us. And he knows what plans he has for us. He knows the things that he has already mapped out for our lives. But we, again, don't necessarily know what those plans are, and we feel like we've got to feel it. We have to say yes, because we don't know fully if that yes that we said is what God wants for us. And so we say yes, and then we recognize we should have said no. And so, how do we get to that place and resting? Um, Sometimes we need to rest. Our body's calling us to rest. God rested, and it's important for us to find that place of how to rest when we are not so filled up with stuff, that it allows us to fill it with God, fill it with His presence, fill it with His power, fill it with the things that He has purposed for us. And sometimes we need new, He wants to, we're committed to negative or toxic relationships. And God was like, I'm trying to show you, the best that I have for you, but you're so caught up in this space of toxicity that you can't see, what's healthy. And so all of these things. And so we want to ask ourselves that question: God, open my eyes. Um, you know, it's the other thought in a conversation who I was talking to, and it was or something I heard this past week, where the prophet Elijah had these servants that he had to release, and he took one with him, Gehazi, and they went up, and he said to him, I can't, God, he was saying, God is for us, and he's and there's out there, and he was like, Lord, open his eyes so that he can see that you are with us. And sometimes he looked and he didn't really see, and he was like, I don't really see that. And he was like, look again. And sometimes we have, God is calling us to look again, so that we can see his best for us, his plan for us, his purpose for us, and that is reflected in our lives and as we transition. And just remember, again, like I said, when we let go of things, there's going to be a period of grieving, and give yourself permission to grieve that loss of what you let go, but then embrace the fact that I'm making space for growth. I'm making space for what God's best for me. And don't, we have to reframe our thoughts on how we say, I get to, I get to let go, because God has a greater plan for me. And I know that, and I know it well. And because I know it well, I'm going to rejoice in the fact that, I get to let go of these things so that I can embrace what God has for me. And so, challenge time. So, what is one thing in your life right now that no longer serves you? And how can you release it this week to make space for God's best? And so, grab those um, pen and paper, grab the, app on your phone, and kind of write down, take an inventory of what am I doing? Sometimes, what commitments do I have right now? Especially the ones where already you have some resentment in doing. Those are probably the ones that you really need to let go of the most. If you find yourself in a place where you're doing something, and you have this commitment, and you're like, oh, I really want to do this, why did I say yes? And that's the first thing to go. If you are surrounded by people and you're like, I don't even really like hanging around with them, but they seem like they're nice, but I don't really want to go. Don't go. We were talking about that today in our discussion, that no is a full sentence. And a lot of times where I'm working on is saying no without having to give you an explanation and the story behind why I'm saying no. And just saying, no, I can't, and be done. and not have to give the whole, see what happened was this is happening and this and that. And because, you know, and so and that's something you may have to let go of. And that's something I need to let go of, to be able to say no and not give a dissertation as to my no, and just let it be a no and stand firm on the no. Just like we talked about in setting boundaries, if you set boundaries and you move them, then it becomes suggestions and no longer full boundaries. So think about that this week, as in the coming weeks, you know, kind of keep that inventory of what is it that I'm doing? What commitments do I have? What relationships that are in my life that I know where God is taking me, and these people may not be ready to go with you. And there's nothing wrong with them. They're just not ready to move into the place where God is taking you. And sometimes we stay with, I don't want to leave them, and we end up getting stuck because they're not moving. And so therefore, because they don't move, you don't move. And we end up in this place where we are stuck. And God is calling us to go up to the mountain, but we stay in the valley with people who aren't moving. So, look at those things. And again, as you're looking at those things, looking at the people, looking at, maybe your habits or any of those things that you have that, you're like, I really need to stop doing this. I really need to stop saying this, because sometimes, our tongue is the thing that gets us in, get in the way of our journey. So look at those things, write them down, you know, take that inventory. Actually, I think sometimes when we take pen and paper and we write stuff down and we see it, typing it is good, writing it on your phone. But I think when you take paper and pen and paper and write it out and you see it and you have to put a thought behind it and the writing of it, I think it makes a big difference instead of typing it on your phone or whatever. Take that pen and paper and write out, what are the commitments that I have that that are draining, that I really don't want to do. I do it because they asked me, but I'm angry and I'm upset and I'm frustrated every time I have to do it, and I don't want to do it. So think about those. Think about the relationships that you have, again, that are draining, that aren't going, they're not moving, and you're like, these people don't want to go anywhere. They don't want, I'm looking to do this. Maybe you want to, you want to save. Maybe you want to go back to school. Maybe you want to write a book. Maybe you want to move. Maybe you want to change jobs. But you're like, but these are my people. But they're stuck, and you need to move. And so sometimes, they can be in your life, but just not in your purpose. And we have to recognize the difference. And, where we can have friendships, but you can still, but the friendships from a distance as you move. So you may have to let those things go as well. What are some thoughts that you have that are negative that you need to let go of? And so write those down, take that inventory and begin to let them go, and shoot me a message and let's talk about that. Whatever it is that you have, you can do it based on my website. You can send me a message there. You can DM me and let me know, what it is that you're working on. What are some of those things? I share mine, each week, the things that as these topics come up, what I'm letting go of and what I'm dealing with. I want you to share with me. Let's dialogue about some of the things that that you need to let go of, and your purpose and where you plan on going. So again, letting go is not a one-time act. It's a journey. It's a rhythm. It's moving forward with your life, and doing things that you know it's constant. So as you're growing, as you're moving, as you're going up, you be letting go. As you're climbing and as you get stronger, there are things that you're going to have to let go of. So every season will ask us to release something so we can embrace something greater. So as you move through this week, remember, freedom isn't about holding on tighter. It's about opening your hands to receive what God has next. And so I'm excited for what God has in store for you, what He has next for you. And so I want to thank you for joining me for week 2 of Breaking Up with Limitations. Next week, we're talking about reawakening our creativity. So some of those things those old projects, those things that we have put to the side that maybe God is saying, okay, it's time for you to pick them up again. And so that He can make room because maybe been holding on to other things that's been in the way of the dream and the plan and the purpose that God has for you, that maybe you have set aside because you don't have room on your plate for it, but it's what God wants for you. So we're going to talk about some of those things, and so that we can run in freedom and in purpose. So thank you again for joining me for another episode of Empowered to Live. I thank you always for being here. For supporting me during this time. You can like, share, and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. If you want to catch some of the older shows, definitely on my channel on YouTube is where they all are, because as you know, Facebook is, they're deleting them every month. They're like, your show for this is gone. So if you want to catch, some of the older series that I may have prefaced during this episode or others, you can check those out on my YouTube channel. So thank you all again for joining me. Have a wonderful night. And remember that we are walking in freedom and in purpose and in enlightenment because God has greater for you, and that we have everything that we need in God to live the empowered life. Have a great night and have a wonderful weekend. Bye bye for now. Catch you next week.